My name is Henry Lawson. At 75, I thought my life had entered its final season of quiet mornings, scented with coffee and cedar, afternoons spent gathering leaves in the small garden where memories of my wife, Margaret, still lingered. I believed I had learned the full meaning of peace, of contentment, after a lifetime of building. But I was wrong, because that very night, under the golden glow of my son's lavish banquet, every illusion shattered. My daughter-in-law, wrapped in a glittering dress like a sheath for her ambition, pointed her manicured finger straight at me before dozens of guests. Her voice rang out sharp and cold, slicing the air in two. "Get him out of my banquet." The words fell like a blade. My son, Daniel, the boy who once held a college diploma paid for with my sweat, my blood, and the splinters buried in my hands, stood silent, eyes lowered, letting the humiliation wash over his father. They looked at the plain clothes I wore, at the calloused hands that had labored all my life, and mistook me for a failure. They mistook my silence for weakness, my quiet life for emptiness. But there was a truth they did not know. For the past 6 months, since the day my lifelong friend and partner, Charles, passed away, I had become the controlling shareholder of Aurora Atelier, the very company my daughter-in-law boasted of working at, drawing her 7-figure salary. When the security guard politely bowed and escorted me out of the high-rise apartment I myself had once helped secure, I felt no anger, only a cold clarity, a steady flame sparking alive in my chest. They were wrong. They thought I was a fading shadow. But that very night, they gave me the reason to rise, not for revenge, but to prove the difference between one who only takes and a man who truly understands the value of a foundation. Before I continue this story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe that a person's worth is measured by character, not by the size of their wallet. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thursday afternoon. In my small woodshop, the last rays of sunlight slipped through the garage slats, catching motes of fine dust and turning the room into a living portrait of memory. The air was thick with the scent of oak and cedar, that raw fragrance that makes one believe things can still endure. The rhythm of the hand plane skimming across cherry wood echoed steady and familiar, like the whisper of an old friend. My hands, slower than they once were, still pressed with resolve against the stubborn grain. Then the phone rang, sharp, intrusive, like an intruder breaking into the silence. I wiped my hands on a rag, sawdust clinging to my fingers, and glanced at the screen. Daniel. My heart faltered. That name still clenched my stomach into a knot that had never quite come undone. I answered. "Hello, Dad." His tone, not the voice of a son to his father, but the voice of an employee addressing a client. Polished, distant, hollow. "Daniel, everything all right?" "Yeah, fine, everything's great." He hesitated, then added, "Listen, Dad, this Saturday Victoria and I are having some people over. It's a pretty important dinner." I leaned back against the cold slab of cherry wood behind me, already knowing what was coming. "How important?" "Well, Victoria's boss, Leonard Grant, will be there. It's a big chance for her to make an impression." I stayed silent. The workshop air seemed to freeze. My eyes drifted to the photo of Margaret on the workbench. In her gaze, I imagined a reminder. "Don't forget your dignity." Daniel wavered, then said, We really want you there. It would mean a lot if you came." I remembered my grandson's birthday party. All evening I sat alone on the porch in the dark. Inside, the glow of a tablet lit the boy's face while his parents laughed with guests. I was like an old relic, left behind and unclaimed. "You still there, Dad?" Daniel asked, a note of worry in his voice. "I'm here," I said softly. "But son, these things don't really suit me anymore." A pause on the line. Then he stammered, "It's just, maybe dress. A little sharper this time." And then I heard her, Victoria, her voice sharp beneath its sweetness, slicing through like a blade. "Tell him this is important. We have to look like a perfect family." Daniel cleared his throat, repeating like a parrot. "Victoria says, what matters is that we look like a family." I closed my eyes. Memories poured in like an old ledger. selling the 20 acres my father left me so Daniel could get his MBA debt-free. Working weekends for 3 years to cover his startup, a failure I never held against him, all because I believed a better start might make him a better man. The silence dragged, a deep groove in my chest. At last, I spoke, each word heavy. "Fine, I'll be there." "Perfect, Dad. That's great." Relief filled his voice. "Just be yourself, the best version of yourself." The call ended before I could ask, "And what, son, is the worst version of me?" "In your eyes?" I looked down at my hands, lined with dust, real and unvarnished. True hands, true life, the opposite of the polished, gleaming world they wanted me to wear. And in that moment, I knew I had just signed an invisible contract with humiliation. I set the phone down and picked up the handplane again. The best version of me, I thought, is the man who knows how to build things that last. The man they long ago decided wasn't worth showing off. I chose my clothes carefully, not to impress them, but to honor myself. A clean, pressed Carhartt flannel shirt, my best pair of khaki trousers, and the Red Wing leather boots I had worn for 25 years, now oiled and polished to a quiet, solemn shine. The old 10-year-old Chevrolet Impala growled reluctantly when I turned the key. Its scratched, faded paint caught the weak glow of the streetlights, the engine so loud it seemed to apologize for its own existence. As I drove into the condominium garage in Bellevue, the tires grated against the tiled floor, starkly out of place beside the polished lineup of Mercedes, Lexus, and Teslas gleaming like an exhibition of power. The parking attendant's fleeting look of polite pity was enough to remind me I was already out of place at the gate. Daniel Lawson and Victoria Hale's apartment was on the 23rd floor, its windows gazing out over a blanket of city lights, glittering like a carpet of diamonds draped across the earth. Inside, the glow of warm amber lights covered everything. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter rang out loud and rehearsed. But there was no warmth in it. The air was heavy with perfume and catered food, smothering the honest scent of wood that still clung to my clothes. Victoria greeted me with a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, though her eyes flicked over my Carhartt shirt, her brow tightening for an instant, a scratch sharp enough to cut. "You came. How unexpected." Her smile gleamed, polished and empty, cold as a marble countertop. She introduced me to a few people with vague words, as if hiding me behind a curtain. "This is Daniel's father. He's retired now." The introduction dangled unfinished, a period that required no explanation. To them, I was nothing but a prefix, Daniel's father. The evening played out like a theater piece in which I had no role. I stood near the window, a glass of soda in hand, the trays of wine passing by without stopping for me. People offered slight nods of courtesy before turning away, their eyes grazing over my worn boots as though I were an exhibit misplaced in the room. Daniel, meanwhile, held court by the fireplace, recounting his recent business trip to Singapore. His voice carried loud and inflated, as though he needed to prove to the crowd that he belonged. The listeners laughed at the right moments, nodded on cue. He shone in the spotlight, while I lingered in the shadows. I felt as though I had wandered into a strange museum, a place where the triumphs of others were displayed in grandeur, while I was nothing but an uninvited guest, displaced. Looking at Daniel, it struck me. He had achieved the life I once dreamed for him. But when he crossed the bridge I built with my blood and sweat, he pulled it up behind him, leaving me stranded on the far bank. Breaking point, when it came, was strangely quiet. We sat down for dinner around a long, glossy mahogany table. Above us, a crystal chandelier blazed, scattering hundreds of reflections across the sparkling glassware. The clinking of silverware, the bursts of laughter, it was all like a symphony of luxury, until I spoke. Leonard Grant, Victoria Hale's boss, was admiring the table. His hand brushed across the polished surface, his eyes full of approval. "This is magnificent," he said in a warm baritone. "I'd guess it's Italian?" Victoria's face lit up instantly, eager to seize the compliment. "Yes, exactly. We had it imported from Italy. But I knew this table. I recognized the bird's eye grain, the distinctive dovetail joinery. This wasn't Italian. This was American black walnut, a stubborn wood that only Vermont craftsmen handled with such mastery. Before I could stop myself, the carpenter in me spoke out. "It truly is a fine piece," I said, my tone respectful yet firm. "American walnut. Only Vermont joiners make dovetails that clean." The room froze. Forks paused mid-air. Laughter died. In its place, a suffocating silence. Leonard leaned in, curious. "Really? How can you tell?" Before I could answer, Victoria's shrill, brittle laugh slashed through the tension. "Oh, Father, always the carpenter. You see wood and forget you're at a fine dinner party, not in your cheap little workshop." Her curled smile was as cold as a knife's edge. Then she turned to Daniel Lawson, her face tightening like stone. "Daniel, call security. I won't have this old man humiliating us in front of my boss." The room sank deeper into silence. Guests stared into their wine glasses or fiddled with their napkins. Leonard lowered his head, his neck flushed red with embarrassment. A woman gave a faint cough to break the air, but fell silent at once. I looked at Daniel. Sweat glistened on his brow. His trembling hands set his fork down. His lips moved, but no words came. In his eyes, I saw only fear and helplessness. He did nothing. He said nothing. He just sat there like a stranger while his father was disgraced. Slowly, I placed my napkin beside my plate, a deliberate, solemn act, like a judge striking his gavel. I rose to my feet. The chair scraped softly against the thick carpet, but in that room it rang like thunder. I looked at Victoria. Her eyes were shards of ice, her mocking smile curled like a question mark. I looked at Daniel, who could not meet my gaze, his face pale and hollow. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was the verdict. I turned and walked out of the dining room. Each step echoed through the heavy air like a sentence delivered upon the man who had chosen silence over defending his father. As I reached the front door, Victoria's voice cut through the air behind me, sharp as a blade. "There, you see, problem solved. That's not Raider." I left. The 2-hour drive back to the other side of Seattle passed in silence. The Bellevue lights shrank in the rearview mirror, glittering. Yes, but cold, like an indifferent constellation. The thorn in Victoria's words, along with the heavier weight of Daniel's silence, slowly dulled. Not because the wound had healed, it had simply become something else, a scar, hardened, numb, and permanent. My battered Chevrolet carried me away from Bellevue's glittering lights, down a road that grew darker and quieter. The glass towers shrank behind me, giving way to sparse trees and the bite of cold air. When I opened the door to my small brick house, the home I had paid off with sweat and calloused hands, the familiar scent of sawdust and the lemon polish Margaret once loved rushed out to greet me. I needed no liquor, no television noise. This was my fortress, where darkness was not a threat but a shelter. I passed through the living room, where the old armchair still sat like a loyal companion, and went straight into my study. On the shelves were worn carpentry books and dog-eared volumes of history. On the desk, the single photograph of Margaret smiling by Lake Washington, the light on her face warmer than the glittering water behind her. Against the wall, beneath a small window, rested a cedar chest, a wedding gift from Charles Bennett nearly 45 years ago. Its dovetail joints so tight you couldn't slip in a sheet of paper. I knelt. The floorboards creaked under my knees. When I lifted the lid, the old hinges groaned, like a sigh from memory. The scent of aged cedar escaped not merely wood, but the breath of time itself. Inside lay layers of keepsakes, faded letters, Margaret's recipe cards, photographs blurred with age. I sifted through until I found what I sought, a folder folded like an accordion, tied with a faded silver ribbon. Within it were relics of a friendship that had shaped my life. A black and white photograph, its edges worn soft from countless hands. 2 young men in their 20s, hair and shirts dusted with sawdust, grinning like fools in a half-built workshop. Charles and I. Back then, we had nothing but a reckless dream and one belief: good wood, if respected, would never betray a man. Beneath it, a napkin from a long-demolished bar. On it, in Charles's bold handwriting, was our first contract. Lawson and Bennett Custom Woodwork. We signed it with a borrowed pen, two dreamers convinced we could build a world out of oak and sweat. And for a time, we did. But Charles was the visionary, the one with a head for business. I was only the craftsman, the man in love with each grain of wood. He built Aurora Atelier into an empire of refined design, while I clung to my modest contracting shop. Yet our friendship never loosened. At the bottom lay the final piece, a cream envelope, sealed in wax, sent to me 6 months ago, 1 week after his funeral. I held it in my hand. My fingers didn't tremble, but my knuckles cracked. When the knife slit the wax, it gave a faint hiss, like a whisper from the past. I opened the letter. Charles's handwriting was shaky, the letters leaning on one another, but his voice was unmistakable. Henry, if you are reading this, then I am gone. Perhaps busy building a workshop with better light. Aurora Atelier was always our dream, even if only my name hung on the sign. You were the foundation. You taught me what integrity means, what it takes to draw a line perfectly straight. That is why I have done this. All of my shares, 60%, are now yours. You are the controlling shareholder. If you wish, you may be chairman of the board. I paused. In the stillness of the room, the words fell upon me like shards of glass. I know you never wanted a corner office, but this company needs a conscience more than it needs another salesman. It needs a compass. And you, my friend, are the compass this world has lost. Do what you believe is right. Protect what we built. Protect the good people. I trust you. I set the letter down, the cedar's scent still clinging to my hands. And I understood. Charles hadn't merely given me shares. He had given me a charge, a compass, a judgment. I could remain silent, or I could rise and reclaim justice for him, for myself, and for the craft. I finished reading, and nothing was the same. I folded Charles Bennett's letter back up and slipped it into its envelope, as if closing the lid on a chapter of my life. For 6 months I had done nothing, partly from grief, partly from a quiet reluctance. I had never believed I belonged to that glossy world of share certificates and boardroom chairs. The shares Charles left me existed only as soulless numbers in the lawyer's file, while I continued living a simple life. But tonight, after Daniel and Victoria's party, after being treated like an excess object in that gleaming room, something changed. Charles had not only left me a company, he had left me a duty, a reminder that a moral compass must not be allowed to stay silent. I sat in my study, where the smell of sawdust still clung to the air. In an old file, tucked into a side pocket, a faded business card caught the light. Richard Cole, Chief Financial Officer, Aurora Atelier. The edges were worn, the embossed type still felt rough under my fingertips. In that moment I understood it was no accident. It was like a flashlight beam pointing straight down the road I had to walk. I picked up the phone. My finger pressed the call button. The small click sounded like a hammer tapping open a door long closed. My heart beat slow and steady. I was no longer the beggar from the dinner party. I was a man holding a moral compass. The phone rang 3 times. Cole, his voice answered, tired, heavy from too many years of work. Richard, this is Henry Lawson. Charles Bennett left Aurora to me. It's time we talked. Silence on the other end, not the silence of surprise, but the silence of a breath held too long and finally released. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but relieved. Henry, it's good you called. Right on time. We met at a small roadside diner, red cracked leather booths, a wall clock whose hands had stuck at the same hour for decades, the faint odor of old coffee. Not a glamorous place, but one where you could speak the truth without worrying about eavesdroppers. Richard was already in the corner, a cup of lukewarm coffee before him and a neat packet of documents at his elbow. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, deeper lines around his eyes, yet his calm was intact. The calm of a man who had lived long enough to know a person's only true asset is integrity. After a few polite remarks, he set his spoon down and said in a low voice, "She's an up-and-comer, Victoria Hale." Charles saw the talent early, but he also saw the ambition. And he worried that she wasn't anchored to anything. I know, I replied. She's anchored to my son, and my son is anchored to her. Richard nodded slowly. His eyes sketched out the geometry of that entanglement. "What do you want, Henry?" I didn't want to say the word revenge. It was too crude, not what I was after. I took a breath and answered, "I want to understand the company Charles left me, and I want to start with her department. I want to see everything, every project, every cost report, every single line item. I need to know what she is doing with his legacy." He didn't ask why. He simply slid the file toward me, as if handing a sword to a warrior. "I thought you might ask," he said. "This is the department overview, but paper tells only half the story. If you want to know the true nature of things, there's another tidier way." He sipped his coffee and looked straight at me. "A surprise audit, entirely legitimate before quarter end. Official reason, cost optimization. The real reason, it shines a light into every shadow she thinks is safe. A lawful tactic, subtle, effective." I laid my hand on the file, feeling the cover press into my skin. Then I nodded. "Do it." 2 words. Quiet. But they carried more weight than anything I'd said in the past year. Victoria Hale basked in the afterglow of the party for 2 days. In her memory, that night had been a perfect hand. Leonard Grant impressed, the clients enchanted, and the little nuisance called my wife's father had been neatly and decisively removed from the picture. On Friday morning she walked into Aurora Atelier's Bellevue headquarters with the air of someone invincible. That day, her presentation for the Rainier Grand Hotel project was on the schedule. This was her masterpiece, a multi-million-dollar contract to redesign the lobbies of a boutique hotel chain, the ticket that would elevate her to senior partner status, finally admitting her into the world that, at last, saw her as she saw herself. The glass conference room gleamed, fluorescent lights stabbed down like surgical lamps. On the screen, a marble staircase appeared as a launchpad for glory. As Victoria was mid-presentation, an email arrived. No fanfare, no ceremony, only a dry subject line. "Department audit notice from the CFO's office." She read it, then read it again. A slight cold curl at her lips. Audit. Just in time. In her mind, the culprit had to be Mark, the jealous colleague who'd coveted the Rainier Grand account for months. This was just his petty move, a challenge, and she was used to challenges. That night the office was empty, the fluorescent lights harsh, the smell of industrial lemon cleaner sharp enough to drown out the aroma of stale coffee. The photocopier whirred, keyboards clicked, paper rustled, a background metronome to a silent battle. Victoria bent over a desk piled with invoices and spreadsheets, eyes racing, a red pen crossing out tiny errors. Every misplaced comma was an enemy to be defeated. Pressure was her fuel. She always performed best with an adversary to overcome. On the drive home she called Daniel, her voice cold over the Bluetooth. "You wouldn't believe it, Daniel. Mark's doing something. A full audit, right before quarter close. It's obviously a cheap power play." Daniel sighed, tired and distant. "Yeah, be careful, Ness. Don't make a fuss." He didn't understand. This wasn't about being careful. This was about winning. Over the next 2 days, Victoria turned the office into a trench. She combed through every number, double-checked even her assistant's work, her scrutinizing gaze making the department's atmosphere leaden. Laughter in the break room died whenever she entered. Staff whispered behind her back. Mark smiled like a man waiting for a collapse. By Monday, the audit was finished. That afternoon, my phone rang. Richard Cole was on the line. His voice was low and slightly sharp. On the surface, it's clean. A few expense items for client entertainment were a bit generous, but nothing alarming. She's very careful. "Azar." "I know," I replied, "but this audit wasn't to find mistakes." He paused, then lowered his voice. "Heavy. And it worked. I've got the full inventory. Every project, every vendor, every deadline. Henry, I've circled one pillar, the Rainier Grand Hotel. That is her entire future." A silence. "If that pillar collapses," Richard said slowly, "the whole building she has erected will fall with it." I looked out at the shop window where the cedar chest Charles had given me sat quietly, a work built to last. "Thank you, Richard," I said, my voice steady. "Now we just wait for the right moment to test the foundation." The audit had been only a prelude, a small ripple announcing an undercurrent. Victoria thought she had survived it, convinced it was merely a petty sabotage by a jealous colleague. She had no idea the tide had already turned against her. In the days that followed, I let silence do its work. I dug in the little garden Margaret used to tend, each shovel stroke a measured knock, a beat of waiting. I strolled the grocery aisles at leisure. I sat on the porch with a book as the first autumn chill came in. I lived like an ordinary man, but in truth, I was sharpening a blade in the quiet. On my desk lay the itemized inventory Richard had given me, like a blueprint of Victoria's professional world. By Friday I called him back. No need to meet at a diner this time, a single call would do. A carpenter knows that to make a true cut, you do not need an audience. "Richard," I said, voice decisive. "The Rainier Grand Hotel project. As majority shareholder, I want you to place it on indefinite hold." Richard didn't ask why. He understood the tool I had in hand. What should I tell Grant? Tell him the new hand at the wheel has changed the ship's course. Tell him this is not personal. This is an order. This will hit her hard, Henry. "I know," I replied, the cold truth heavy in my chest. That's the point. The news did not arrive for Victoria like thunder. It slid through the air like a cold blade, an unemotional work email from Leonard Grant's office. Subject: Rainier Grand Hotel project temporarily suspended. She was presenting a budget adjustment when the phone buzzed. Her confident smile faltered. Her face went pale. She gripped the phone so tight her knuckles went white. Her steps out of the room were unsteady when she excused herself. This time it was not annoyance. It was raw, icy panic. Rainier Grand was more than a contract. It was her coronation, the wind that would have lifted her into an untouchable tier, the ladder that would erase the middle-class past she despised. Having it frozen for no reason, without warning, was a mortal blow. She immediately sought answers. She called Leonard Grant. He banged the table, angry but helpless. "It's this mysterious new shareholder. No one knows who he is, but he's frightened the whole board." She tried to reach Richard's office, but his assistant stood like a polite bastion of company protocol. "Mr. Cole is in a meeting." All hypotheses about a rival company fell apart. This was an absolute power move, a ghost inside the machine, quietly pulling the most consequential levers. That night in the Bellevue apartment, the thin veneer of civility cracked. The chandelier threw cold light. The sound of furniture hitting the floor echoed. Victoria screamed, flinging a stack of design magazines to the floor. "Someone is trying to destroy me, Daniel. This is not a setback. This is an execution. And you're just sitting there." Daniel sat mute, sweat beading on his forehead, that familiar helplessness constricting him. His voice trembled with guilt. "If it's him, then it's my fault. I let this happen. I won." Victoria stopped, eyes flashing with fury. "Him? You mean your father? That Carpenter? Don't be ridiculous. What could he possibly do?" Daniel looked down, voice weak. "I don't know, but he used to be a contractor for 30 years. He knows people, and after that party, he was furious. Maybe he called in a favor or complained to some regulatory board. I'm not sure, but maybe it's him." A crazy notion. A retired old carpenter steering a multi-million-dollar project off course. But for Victoria, it was the only hypothesis that put a face on the invisible enemy. The old man, the bum, the inconvenience who had dared to humiliate her in front of her boss. In her eyes, panic began to harden into something else, a cold, knife-edged rage. She looked at Daniel, her voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "Put your coat on. We're going to see your father. Tonight that old man is going to learn how to bow." Dusk painted the quiet street in gold, the last rays slanting through the small window and brushing the dust on the mantel, where Margaret's smiling photo still rested. I had just wiped the frame and set it down carefully, as if to let her witness what was about to unfold. The screech of BMW tires on gravel outside shattered the stillness, too aggressive, too loud against the calm I had preserved for 40 years. I didn't step out. I let them knock. The door burst open, carrying with it a rush of cold air. Daniel stood awkwardly, his eyes lost in the modest home where every corner still breathed family memories he had abandoned. By contrast, Victoria entered like a predator staking new territory. Her heels struck the wood floor in sharp, claiming beats. Her designer bag landed on the armchair where Margaret once sat knitting a challenge in the form of possession. "Enough, Henry," she hissed, her voice cold as a blade. "Your cheap little games end here. You have no power left to interfere in our lives." I turned, my voice low and steady. "I don't know what game you're talking about, Victoria." Daniel stepped forward, his voice trembling, sweat beading on his forehead. "Dad, please, don't push this any further. I can't take it." Victoria laughed dryly, but the sound snapped into a sharp, angry gasp. "You're sabotaging my career. You made calls, used your old connections to freeze the Rainier Grand project. I want you to undo it. Now." The grandfather clock in the hall ticked, each strike pressing down on the heavy silence. I lowered myself into the old armchair, its worn arms molded to me over the years, and asked, "Why should I?" Victoria lifted her chin, eyes flashing. "Because you're bitter. Because you were humiliated at that party. Because you're jealous we built a life you could only dream of. You're resentful and want to punish us for not needing you anymore." I let her finish, then drew a slow breath. "Bitter? No, Victoria. Bitterness belongs to those who've never built anything and live in fear of losing everything. I spent my life paying the price to lay the foundation of the very house you live in. I'm not bitter. I'm disappointed." My eyes turned to my son. A father has the right to be disappointed when his son sits silent while his wife calls security to throw him out of his own home. Then I looked back at Victoria, my voice quiet but cutting. "And a craftsman has the right to be disappointed when a designer can't tell the difference between American black walnut and cheap Italian veneer." Her face flickered, rage laced with fear. Daniel grimaced, his trembling hands clenching and then falling limp, but I wasn't finished. I began reading out my ledger, the sacrifices etched deep, like carvings in wood. I sold the only piece of land my father left me so Daniel could earn an MBA without debt. When his first company collapsed, I drained my retirement savings to cover the losses, to keep his credit intact. I sold my only car so he could make a job interview, stayed up nights taking extra work to pay his tuition on time. I didn't shout. I recited, slow and steady, like turning the pages of a ledger. That wasn't investment, that was a gift. And the only thing I ever asked in return was a little respect. Not applause, just the bare minimum of decency. Don't treat me like a beggar at my own son's table. Silence thickened in the room until the floor creaked under Victoria's heels. The story they had told themselves that they were self-made heroes, while I was just a bitter old man, had cracked wide open. Victoria blinked, clutching at the last scraps of pride. "This changes nothing," she said, her voice faintly shaking. "Next week there's a board meeting. I'll convince them. You can't stop me." I only looked at her, silent. No more words were needed. She couldn't even imagine a power she couldn't flatter, couldn't manipulate. Daniel stammered, his voice barely a whisper, like a confession. "Ness, maybe we should just go." Victoria spun on her heel, shoulders rigid. The door closed hard behind them, and the BMW's engine roared, tires grinding gravel as if trying to swallow the silence of the small house. But in that silence, the verdict had already been delivered. I sat in the armchair long after their BMW had vanished down the street. Streetlights slanted through the window, darkness swallowed the house. This time the quiet was no longer loneliness. It felt like strategy. Victoria had been right about one thing. The upcoming board meeting was her only chance. She would obsessively prepare for it, pouring every ounce of talent and ambition into a presentation meant to impress the anonymous new chairman. She had no idea she would be presenting directly to the beggar she had once chased from the dinner table. The confrontation at my house had shaken them, but I knew Victoria well enough to predict her next move. A cornered animal does not learn humility, it only finds new ways to attack. She would cling all the tighter to the only power she trusted: her performance. It was time to give her a stage. The next morning I called Richard Cole. My voice was short and hard, like a carpenter's straight edge. "Richard," It's time. Announce the future, and give her a stage. On the other end he exhaled, a hint of sour amusement in his tone. You understand, Henry. A cornered animal often goes for broke. She won't just take the bait. She'll try to swallow both bait and hook. I answered calmly, as if pronouncing a sentence already set. Let her swallow. It will cut her own throat. My instruction was simple. Schedule a mandatory town hall for next Friday. Subject: a new strategic vision and introduction of the new leadership. And add a special item: presentations of key strategic projects, pending final approval by the chairman. An hour later, the email went out. It landed in Victoria's inbox like a cold verdict. On her screen, the subject line read, Subject: Town Hall Meeting, Mandatory Attendance. To her eyes, that wasn't an email. It was the blow of a gavel. For weeks, Victoria had been fighting an invisible ghost. Now that power was offering her a chance, a spotlight. In her mind, the story clarified. The audit had been a test. The frozen project had been a test. This meeting was the final exam. If she presented brilliantly, if she could dazzle the new chairman with her talent and vision, she would win everything back. From that moment on, everything outside the Rainier Grand project ceased to exist. She canceled dinners, arrived at the office before dawn, and left only after the city lights came up. The fluorescent lights beat down like surgical lamps. The conference room turned into a training ground. Staff were put through harsh rehearsals, slides dissected, every figure scrutinized, every phrase honed. The air grew thick, like a pressure chamber. Daniel later told me she was possessed. Her eyes burned with manic energy. She muttered about profit margins and aesthetic concepts in her sleep. He once caught her practicing lines in front of a mirror at night, reapplying lipstick like an actor before curtain. Another time, a spilled cup of coffee ruined a printed deck, leaving a spreading blotch, a small bad omen, but she only smiled coldly and said, "A challenge." Meanwhile, I lived quietly. I visited Margaret's grave and left a simple bunch of wildflowers. I spent an afternoon in the shop, sanding down an old piece of walnut until the grain softened under my hand like silk. Layer after layer of fake finish came away, just as Victoria's mask of ambition would soon be stripped. I watched the autumn leaves fall, each one letting go without a fight. I was not preparing for a battle. I was preparing a reckoning. On Thursday night, Richard Cole called. "Everything's ready, Henry," he said. "She thinks this presentation will save her career." I looked out at the still lake under the night sky, moonlight trembling into ripples. "Good," I replied. "Let her do it." The date was set, the trap was laid, and the leading lady rehearsed obsessively for an ending she did not know I had written long ago. While Victoria honed her ambition into a weapon, I found peace and stillness. I did not need to prepare a speech. The truth requires no rehearsal. It only needs a man brave enough to stand behind it. The week before the Friday meeting felt to me more like a series of solemn rituals than work. On Wednesday I drove out to the cemetery. Autumn wind bit at my face. Dry leaves skittered over the headstones. In the distance, a crow cried, eerie as a funeral bell. I stopped at Margaret's grave, a simple granite slab engraved, "Margaret Lawson, a life lived with grace." I replaced the wilted bouquet with a handful of wild daisies picked from the forest edge. When my hand touched the stone, the cold seemed to draw the warmth from my skin. It hurt, and it woke me up. I did not speak aloud. I never did. But in the silence of my mind, I told her everything. About the party, the word beggar, Daniel's silence, Charles Bennett's letter, and the burden he left behind. I admitted to myself that I was afraid not of them, but of becoming a man Margaret would not recognize. "Margaret, look, tomorrow I will not be silent anymore," I whispered in my head. When the sun sank and long shadows fell across the grass, I left. A calm settled into my bones. I realized I was not just defending a company. I was preserving the life we had built together. The next day I spent the whole morning in the shop. Pale golden light slanted through the small window. Wood dust hung in the air like mist. I set a rough piece of walnut on the workbench. No particular project, I simply wanted to listen to the familiar conversation between my hands and the grain. The plane blade sang, a steady rhythm like an ancient drum. The rough surface peeled away, revealing the true face of the wood. Faint curls of fragrant shavings gathered at my feet. Then, I moved to sandpaper, from coarse to fine, each pass removing layers of falsehood to reveal what was real beneath. When I finished, the walnut was as smooth as silk. Its deep, intricate grain gleamed under the workshop light. It was only a scrap of wood, but to me it was proof that disorder could be turned into order by patience and integrity. That night, with the scent of walnut still on my hands, I picked up the phone and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, guarded. "Hello, Dad." "Tomorrow," I said, voice firm as a command. "There's a town hall at Aurora Atelier. You have to come, not just for the company. You need to see the truth." There was a pause, as if he were holding his breath. "What truth, Dad? I'm not sure I'm ready." I cut him off, short and decisive. "No one is ever ready for justice, Daniel, but it still comes." He hesitated, voice trembling with guilt. "All right, I'll come." 2,200. I did not thank him. I only said, "Good." He needed to be there. He needed to witness the consequences of the choices he had made and the choices he had failed to make. Before going to bed, I stood in my study and looked at the old black and white photograph. Me and Charles, two young men smudged with sawdust, hands raw, still clasping each other's. In those bright eyes lived the belief that we would live true to the quality of our work and to the people who stood shoulder to shoulder with us. "Charles," I whispered to the memory in the photograph, "I will do right by us, for both of us." The grandfather clock told each hour. Autumn wind whistled through the window like a countdown. I turned out the light. The room fell dark, leaving only the photograph of two young men smiling among the shavings. A past lived, a future about to be judged. Tomorrow, words would end. It was time to show them what a foundation built to last actually looks like. The great conference hall of Aurora Atelier looked like a cathedral of glass and steel. Cold white ceiling lights shone down like scalpels. The long obsidian table reflected the dark skyline like a blackened lake, and the air conditioner droned steadily. The scent of money mingled with sterile metal, the complete opposite of the warm timber of my workshop. I did not sit in the room. I watched from a monitor Richard Cole had prepared. I did not want to appear as a character. I wanted to appear as a consequence. Employees filed in, pressed suits, elegant dresses, fingers tapping pens against notepads, the scattered clatter of keyboards. Daniel sat in the front row of the guest section, tense, loosening and tightening his tie, eyes darting as though searching for an escape. Victoria Hale took the stage. Her tailored white suit stood out like a lighthouse against the dark wood and charcoal upholstery. Her smile was rehearsed, her confidence was thick as substance. The presentation, I must admit, was excellent. Her voice was fluent, accented, authoritative. On the screen, the Rainier Grand Hotel project unfolded in splendor. Bespoke woodwork, custom lighting, a seamless brand story. She spoke the language of luxury. The whole hall nodded along. Talent, yes, but talent without integrity is just a beautiful house built on rotten foundations. She finished. Applause broke like a wave. Her triumphant smile glowed under the lights. She believed she had saved herself. Richard Cole stepped forward, his gray suit plain, his calmness a counterweight. He waited for the applause to fade. "Thank you, Victoria. That truly was an excellent presentation." He scanned the room. "As you know, Aurora Atelier has undergone a transfer of ownership, a return to the founding principles. Today, I am honored to introduce the new chairman of the board. He holds 75% controlling interest. He was a lifelong friend, the very first partner of Charles Bennett, and in my professional judgment, one of the finest craftsmen I have ever known. Above all, he is the only man fit to safeguard the soul of this company. Please welcome Henry Lawson." I stepped out from the wings. Flannel shirt, khaki trousers, the very clothes I had worn on that dinner night. My shoes struck the stone floor with a dry, echoing sound like a verdict pronounced. The room lost its air. Silence thickened. Every eye turned to me. I looked at Victoria. Her smile froze, red lipstick suddenly adrift like paint on a cracking statue. Behind her eyes, frantic calculations scrambled for an impossible answer. The beggar, the old carpenter, her face drained pale. I glanced at Daniel. His mouth hung open, hands trembling, tie slack. He looked like a child caught in a lie. In that instant, I saw realization slow, deep, painful. I stood at the podium. No notes, no rehearsal, only the truth. "Victoria," I said, voice not loud but clear, "that was an excellent presentation. You have a fine eye for design." The compliment fell like a drop of cold water. She flinched. However, a good designer knows the value of material, and a great leader knows the value of people. In both, you are gravely lacking. The room was still, save for the faint whir of the projector. A few weeks ago, in a house built on the foundation of my life's work, you ordered security. Remove that beggar from the table. I held her gaze beneath the stage lights that pinned her in place. Today, here, I order you to clear out your desk. A sharp intake of breath swept the room. Victoria staggered, her fingers clutching the podium until they whitened, her nails scraping softly against the wood. "However," I continued, voice flat as a blade, "Aurora Atelier is not without mercy. There is a vacancy in the company cafeteria washing dishes. That job requires respect for what others leave behind and a commitment to keeping things clean. Perhaps that is where you can begin again." That was all, and the invisible structure of her world collapsed. She did not scream, she did not faint, she sank, shoulders heavy, head bowed, a dry sob cracking the silence, chilling the room. The curtain had fallen. Daniel leapt to his feet, stumbling toward the stage. Not to defend her, not to oppose me, but like a man rushing blindly toward an earthquake's epicenter. He stopped at the foot of the podium, hand reaching out, face shattered. "Dad, I didn't." The words would not form. I looked at my son. The old anger dissolved, leaving only a tired sorrow. He was not a villain. He was just a weak man, guilty of too many mistakes. "We'll talk later, Daniel," I said, my voice softer, "when you remember who you are." The chairman's office on the top floor of Aurora Atelier did not remain a corner of power for long. Within a week, I had Richard Cole remove the ostentatious glass desk, and those rigid leather chairs pieces made to intimidate, not to converse. I brought in my old oak work table from home. On the cabinet, I arranged my well-worn hand planes in a neat row. The warm golden glow from the desk lamp spread across the room, carrying the scent of cedar and linseed oil. The faint creak of wood accompanied me as I tested the new rocking chair I had been designing. The space no longer felt like an office. It felt like a workshop of meditation, a place of truth, the complete opposite of the cold atmosphere of corporate power. As I had expected, Victoria Hale never took the cafeteria job. The day after the meeting, her desk was bare. Her name vanished from the company directory, and soon after, she vanished from the city altogether, a ghost woven from ambition and a fractured story. I never heard of her again. About a month later, Daniel appeared. He did not call ahead. He simply stepped into my new workshop quietly, slowly. His shoes echoed on the wooden floor, each step heavy as though burdened with guilt. I did not look up at once. I let the silence stretch, so that the distance between father and son could be felt in every breath. When I finally raised my eyes, I saw a different Daniel. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a plain shirt and jeans. His face was gaunt, his stubble unshaven, his posture weary. Yet in his eyes, for the first time in years, there was something new, clarity. He inhaled the scent of wood deeply, then spoke in a low but steady voice. "I've applied for a job, a non-profit that builds homes for low-income families. Next week I'll start as an apprentice." He glanced down at his soft, uncalloused hands. I thought money and status would make me strong, but all they did was make me more of a coward. I don't want to run anymore. I want to learn how to build something real, with my own two hands. I did not rise. The chasm between us was too wide to be bridged by an easy embrace. Quick forgiveness would only be another lie, and we had lived with enough lies already. Instead, I nodded slowly. I reached for the block of black walnut I had sanded the day before the boardroom showdown. Smooth as silk, its deep grain carried the scars of life. I held it a moment longer, like a ritual, before handing it to Daniel. "Start with this," I said, my voice low and firm, like a verdict. "Feel it. Understand its grain, its weight, its honesty. A man only truly exists when he knows how to build something that will outlast himself. When you understand the wood, come back, and we'll talk about building a house." He accepted the block, holding it as though it might break. His hand trembled as he pressed his palm against its surface, searching for warmth. His fingers traced the lines I had left in it, and his eyes filled with tears. In that moment, I heard Margaret's voice in memory. "One day, if he loses his way, let his hands guide him home." Daniel looked up, and for the first time in 20 years, when our eyes met, I no longer saw a stranger, no longer just a son who only knew how to demand. We were no longer two men stranded on opposite shores. We were father and son, seeing each other through the same grain of wood. That night, long after Daniel had left, I stood alone on the small balcony outside my new office. The city of Seattle stretched below, its stream of car lights and high-rise windows forming a golden but cold river, surging endlessly without rest. The wind slipped through the steel railings, carrying with it the scent of dust and smoke, the dry tang of metal, a reminder that the world down there remained full of chaos and illusions. The distant wail of car horns blended with the howling wind, composing an unending score. But within me, all was quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but of balance. My hand tightened lightly on the cold steel railing. The deep lines around my eyes slowly eased. The city's lights reflected in my gaze, but I no longer belonged to that glittering stage. I belonged here, this bare, narrow balcony, where truth did not need spotlights to exist. I whispered softly, as if speaking to Margaret across the night. "Do you see, Margaret? It was never about winning or losing. It was only about truth being restored to its rightful place." A single yellow leaf, caught by the wind, spun off the balcony into the streets below, a reminder that old illusions had finally fallen away. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heartbeat steady, unyielding proof that I had stood firm through the storm. I did not feel victory. The bitterness of revenge had long since dissolved, nor did I feel joy. The cost of this reckoning had been too high. What remained was only a quiet peace, immovable and calm. The scales had returned to balance, and from that balance rose a lesson carved in stone. A man's dignity is non-negotiable. It is his spine. Once broken, he will never stand straight again. It is the foundation of his life, never to be traded for the sake of comfort, for keeping the peace, or for carrying the burdens of others, not even family. When you allow your sacrifices to be treated as an entitlement, you are not being merciful. You are only teaching others that your self-respect is a resource they may exploit. Setting boundaries is not an act of war. It is self-preservation. It is the moment you decide that your silence will no longer be mistaken for consent. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors. Doors that teach others they must knock with respect before they may enter your life. They are the quiet but irreversible act of reclaiming the keys to your own house and deciding who truly deserves to be welcomed. If you believe dignity is the most precious asset a man can possess, leave a comment below. I hold the keys to my own life. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next story where the strength of the silent ones is always honored.